The origins of Jewish presence in the Transalpine territories, now recognized as Switzerland, are fundamentally linked to the expansion of the Roman Empire into the provinces of Raetia and Germania Superior during the first century of the Common Era. Archaeological evidence, most notably the discovery of a lead seal in Augusta Raurica, the oldest Roman colony on the Rhine, features a seven-branched menorah signifying a physical and commercial link to Judean merchants operating within the imperial military infrastructure. These early residents did not exist as a separate political entity, but functioned as Roman citizens under the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, which granted universal citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, regardless of creed. Their settlement patterns were dictated by the strategic geography of the Roman castra, concentrating along the vital riparian arteries of the Rhine and Ahr valleys to manage the logistics of the frontier. The legal standing of these individuals during the late antiquity period was governed by the Theodosian Code and the subsequent Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, which formally recognized Judaism as a religio licita, or permitted religion. This protected status ensured that Jewish merchants could maintain their communal structures while facilitating the movement of specie and Mediterranean commodities across the Great St. Bernard and Splugen passes. As the Roman administrative apparatus began to contract in the 5th century, these populations remained embedded within the surviving urban cores of former civitates like Aventicum and Vindonissa. During the Merovingian and Carolingian eras, the Jewish role transitioned into that of specialized economic intermediaries, often serving as court agents for local bishops who inherited the municipal authority of the defunct Roman magistrates. The Capitularies of Charlemagne and the decrees of Louis the Pious specifically addressed the status of these palace Jews, granting them immunity from certain tolls and permitting them to manage the trade in precious metals and luxury textiles. This proto-mercantile framework preceded the feudal rigidity of the High Middle Ages, positioning the Jewish minority as a mobile and legally distinct class that operated outside the traditional agrarian manorial system. By the time the Diocese of Basel and the Abbey of St. Gall emerged as dominant regional powers in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Jewish community had already established a precedent for urban residency based on imperial charters rather than local feudal tenure. This deep antiquity is crucial for understanding the subsequent demographic shifts, as it proves that the Jewish presence was not an exogenous medieval insertion, but a legacy of the Mediterranean administrative order that had initially colonized the Helvetian Plateau. The transition into the 12th century saw these residents move from dispersed agents of the crown into organized, urban collectives, forming the demographic nucleus of the Judeae Proprii, who would later inhabit the burgeoning city-states of the Swiss plateau. The 13th century in the Swiss territories was defined by a profound urban revolution, characterized by the granting of municipal charters and the physical expansion of market towns, which necessitated the active recruitment of specialized financial agents. The Zähringer and Habsburg dynasties, seeking to consolidate their territorial sovereignty, recognized that the formation of stable, taxable urban centers required the liquid capital and international credit networks possessed by the Jewish community. In Basel, the episcopal administration formally integrated Jewish residents as essential fiscal contributors to the city's burgeoning role as a bridgehead for transalpine commerce. Similarly, the founding of Bern in 1191 and its subsequent rise as an imperial free city by 1218 provided a structural vacuum in the local economy that Jewish financiers were invited to fill, acting as the primary source of non-agrarian capital. The integration process was facilitated by the Judenregel, a royal prerogative that permitted local secular and ecclesiastical lords to grant residency rights in exchange for annual protection fees. In Zurich, the municipal council actively encouraged the settlement of Jewish families near the Limmat River, recognizing that their presence was vital for the circulation of currency within the local textile and leather guilds. These families did not arrive as impoverished refugees, but as capital-rich entrepreneurs who brought sophisticated bookkeeping methods and instruments of credit, such as the Wekel or letter of exchange, which were previously absent from the regional market. This economic symbiosis allowed Swiss cities to bypass the restrictive barter systems of the high Alpine valleys, linking the northern Rhine markets with the Mediterranean trade routes through the St. Gotthard Pass. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? By the mid-1200s, the Jewish population had become an institutionalized component of the urban social hierarchy, occupying a middle tier between the emerging patrician families and the artisan classes. They were granted the right to own real estate within the city walls, leading to the development of the first permanent Judengassen, Jewish lanes, in Basel and Zurich. These enclaves were not yet restrictive ghettos, but were strategically located near the central marketplaces and city halls to ensure rapid access for the municipal authorities who relied on Jewish loans to fund public infrastructure projects and defensive fortifications. The Ratsprotokolle, council records from this period, document frequent transactional interactions where mayors and city councilors served as both the protectors and the primary debtors of the Jewish residents. Furthermore, the initial welcome was reinforced by a legal framework that permitted Jewish communal autonomy in internal religious and civil matters. This period of relative stability allowed for the establishment of the first indigenous rabbinical courts, which provided the legal certainty necessary for complex commercial contracts to be enforced across municipal boundaries. The integration of the Jewish community was therefore a calculated administrative strategy employed by the Swiss city-states to secure the financial machinery required for their transition from feudal outposts to independent mercantile republics. This initial phase of cooperation provided the Swiss urban elite with the silver bullion and credit lines necessary to challenge the traditional manorial dominance of the surrounding nobility, establishing a precedent of economic utility that would define the first half of the 13th century. The constitutional standing of Jewish residents in the Swiss territories was governed by the doctrine of servitudo camerae literalis, or chamber serfdom, a legal fiction that bypassed the traditional feudal hierarchy to place the community under the direct personal jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Emperor. This designation, codified in the 1236 privilege issued by Frederick II, defined the Judei proprii as a distinct legal class whose bodies, assets, and commercial interests were technically the property of the imperial treasury. Unlike the Christian peasantry bound to the soil or the urban burgesses protected by municipal charters, the Jewish population existed as a fiscal appendage of the crown, rendering them exempt from the authority of local manorial courts and the canon law of the regional dioceses. In the Swiss context, this imperial prerogative was frequently decentralized, as the Hohenstaufen and Habsburg monarchs leased the jury regal, the right to tax and protect Jewish subjects, to secondary lords such as the Counts of Kyburg or the Prince-Bishops of Basel. This relationship was fundamentally defined by the principle of tuitio, a mutual obligation where the sovereign provided physical sanctuary and judicial recourse in exchange for the payment of the Opferpfennig, a specialized head tax. For the Jewish communities of the Swiss plateau, this imperial protection functioned as a high-level insurance policy, allowing them to conduct credit operations across territorial boundaries without fear of localized confiscation. The legal reality of being servants of the chamber meant that any injury inflicted upon a Jewish resident was prosecuted as an act of lese majesty, a direct offense against the emperor's own financial interests. However, this status also carried the burden of total fiscal liability. The monarch or his delegates possessed the unilateral right to use the Jewish community as a liquid asset, frequently pledging their future tax revenues as collateral for royal debts or even selling the rights to their presence to city councils in Bern and Zurich. The implementation of this status in the Swiss Alpine regions was unique due to the increasing autonomy of the Eidgenossenschaft, confederacy, which created a friction point between imperial law and local municipal ordinances. As Swiss towns grew in political power, they sought to acquire the Judenregal for themselves, effectively becoming the lords of their resident Jewish populations and collecting the protection fees that previously flowed to the central imperial treasury. By the mid-13th century, the legal identity of the Swiss Jewry had transitioned into a dual dependency. They remained imperial servants under the overarching Reichsrecht, but were simultaneously subject to the letter of privilege issued by the local municipal councils. These documents, renewed periodically, specified the duration of residency and the precise interest rates allowed, creating a rigid contractual existence that superseded the more flexible customary laws of the period. Furthermore, the Kammerknechtschaft status necessitated a high degree of communal self-regulation to ensure the collective ability to satisfy imperial tax demands. The Jewish Aljama, or community organization, was held legally responsible for the debts of its individual members, a system of collective surety that the Swiss authorities utilized to maximize revenue extraction. This legal framework ensured that the Jewish community remained a closed demographic unit, physically integrated into the city but legally isolated from the evolving rights of the Christian guilds. The servant status thus provided a temporary shield against the growing religious hostility of the lower social orders, but it simultaneously entrenched the community's vulnerability by making their survival entirely dependent on their continued fiscal utility to the reigning political elite. The economic vitality of the 13th century Swiss urban landscape was predicated on a sophisticated system of credit that functioned as the primary engine for monumental civic and ecclesiastical construction. As the burgeoning city-states of the Swiss plateau transitioned from timber-based settlements to stone-fortified municipalities, The demand for immediate liquid capital outpaced the agrarian revenues of the local nobility and the tithing income of the church. Jewish financiers emerged as the sole providers of large-scale, long-term credit, utilizing the mortgage bond to underwrite the expansion of key architectural landmarks. In Basel, the financing of the cathedral's structural reinforcements and the procurement of imported materials were facilitated through substantial advances provided by Jewish creditors, who accepted ecclesiastical land rents and future tithes as collateral. This role was distinct from that of the Christian merchant, whose capital was largely tied to physical inventory, whereas Jewish wealth was specifically managed for liquidity and reinvestment into the municipal infrastructure. The construction of guild halls and defensive perimeters in Zurich and Bern further demonstrated the institutional dependency on Jewish capital. Municipal councils frequently secured bridge loans to pay the specialized masons and engineers required for the erection of city walls and watchtowers, assets that were vital for the towns to maintain their status as free imperial cities. These transactions were meticulously documented in the Libri Jurium, Books of Rights, which recorded the legal priority of Jewish claims over the movable property of the burgesses. By providing the necessary silver bullion to settle payments across municipal borders, Jewish agents enabled Swiss towns to acquire architectural prestige that far exceeded their immediate tax capacity. This availability of credit also stimulated the regional labor market, as the influx of Jewish-funded currency allowed for the consistent employment of thousands of skilled laborers during the lengthy summer building seasons typical of the Alpine foothills. The mechanisms of this lending were technically advanced, involving the use of chattel mortgages and the securitization of urban real estate. Jewish financiers specialized in the Rentenkauf, a system where they purchased the right to a fixed annual income from a specific property in exchange for a lump sum payment. This allowed the Swiss patriciate to unlock the value of their inherited lands to fund their political ambitions and military equipment without violating the canonical prohibitions on direct interest between Christians. The Jewish role was therefore catalytic, transforming static land wealth into the dynamic financial energy required for the Swiss transition into a monetized economy. Furthermore, the presence of this capital source allowed for the establishment of early insurance protocols for transalpine trade, as Jewish lenders often provided the high-risk funding necessary for caravans crossing the hazardous mountain passes. The fiscal integration reached a peak where the debt held by Jewish individuals became an indispensable component of the municipal balance sheet. In many instances, the city councils themselves acted as the primary borrowers, utilizing Jewish loans to acquire new territories or to purchase the Jewry Regal from the Habsburg crown. This created a paradoxical economic environment where the very structures that defined Swiss municipal identity, the town gates, the council chambers, and the monumental bridges, were often physically realized through the systematic application of Jewish-held capital. The community's specialized profession thus acted as the invisible scaffold for the physical and political expansion of the Swiss Confederacy's founding cities, establishing a financial architecture that remained unchallenged until the demographic and religious shifts of the late 13th century began to erode the transactional basis of this coexistence. The physical manifestation of medieval Jewish life in the Swiss territories was defined by a specialized urban infrastructure that facilitated religious observance, judicial self-governance, and ritual purity within the stone-built quarters of the old towns. Unlike the temporary timber dwellings of the peripheral peasant classes, the Jewish enclaves of Zurich and Basel were characterized by substantial masonry constructions that have left a discernible archaeological footprint. The focal point of these settlements was the shola, or synagogue, which functioned as the multifunctional heart of the community. Archaeological excavations near the Brungasse in Zurich have uncovered remains of these 13th century structures, revealing interior layouts designed to accommodate the bima, the elevated platform for Torah reading, and the Aron Kodesh. These buildings were often constructed using local sandstone and integrated into the existing street frontage, reflecting an architectural synthesis with the surrounding Swiss, Romanesque and early Gothic styles while maintaining distinct internal liturgical orientations. Communal life also necessitated the establishment of the Hevra Kadisha, burial society, and the acquisition of extramural land for dedicated cemeteries. Due to the high value of urban real estate within the Swiss city walls, Jewish cemeteries were typically located outside the primary defensive perimeters, such as the Spalenberg in Basel. These sites served as the definitive record of the community's multi-generational residency, with tombstones featuring sophisticated Hebrew epigraphy that documented the migration of scholars and families from across the Rhineland. The administrative maintenance of these grounds was governed by specific cemetery privileges granted by the municipal councils, ensuring the inviolability of the graves in exchange for recurring land use fees. These external sites provided a physical boundary to the Jewish presence, mirroring the legal isolation of the Judae proprii while establishing a permanent sacred geography that persists in the modern Swiss urban plan. Furthermore, the domestic architecture within the Swiss Judengassen often included private prayer rooms and study halls, known as Bet Midrash, which supported a high level of indigenous literacy and legal scholarship. The stone houses of the wealthier financiers were equipped with vaulted strongrooms intended to safeguard both religious scrolls and the liquid bullion assets essential for their credit operations. These residences were frequently interconnected through internal courtyards, creating a semi-private communal space that allowed for the maintenance of traditional dietary laws and social customs away from the public eye of the marketplaces. This architectural density, combining the public scola, the subterranean mikveh, and the fortified private residence, transformed the Swiss Jewry into a highly organized and resilient urban entity. The existence of this specialized stone infrastructure serves as a verifiable record of the community's integration into the physical fabric of the Swiss city-states, a presence that remained structurally dominant until the theological and political upheavals of the 1290s mandated its systematic destruction. The socio-religious equilibrium of the Swiss urban centers was fundamentally destabilized in the mid-13th century by the institutional expansion of the mendicant orders, specifically the Dominicans and Franciscans, into the Rhine Valley. Unlike the established monastic orders that operated within the isolated agrarian manorial system, these friars were explicitly urban-focused, establishing convents within the city walls of Basel and Zurich to directly engage the merchant and artisan classes. Their arrival introduced a new rhetorical framework that prioritized apostolic poverty and categorized the specialized credit operations of the Jewish community not merely as a fiscal necessity, but as a moral corruption of the Christian body politic. The preachers utilized public squares and newly constructed mendicant churches to disseminate a rigorous interpretation of the usury doctrine, framing the taking of interest as a form of spiritual theft that exploited the Christian laborer. In Basel, the Dominican Studium Generale became a center for the systematic study of anti-Jewish polemics, producing a generation of clerics who viewed the Jewish minority through the lens of ecclesiastical subordination rather than imperial protection. These friars were instrumental in shifting the public discourse from the transactional utility of the Judæ proprii to the theological perceived dangers of their proximity. They advocated for the strict implementation of the Constitutio Judaeorum, arguing that the legal privileges granted by the Holy Roman Emperor were secondary to the spiritual requirement of keeping the faithless in a state of visible servitude. This intellectual movement successfully pressured the municipal councils to reconsider the terms of Jewish residency, transforming the previously neutral marketplace into a site of ideological conflict where the terms of every commercial contract were subjected to moral scrutiny by the clergy. The influence of the mendicants was particularly effective among the emerging guilds, whose members were often the primary debtors of the Jewish financiers. By characterizing the interest-bearing loan as an unnatural profit, the friars provided the artisan classes with a religiously sanctioned justification for their mounting economic resentment. This era saw the introduction of the St. Peter's pence and other specialized tithes intended to fund the mendicant missions, further draining the liquid capital of the towns and creating a competitive friction between the church's financial demands and the Jewish credit market. The sermons delivered during Lent and Advent frequently targeted the blindness of the Jews, a theme that reinforced the social distance between the populations and eroded the casual interactions that had characterized the early 1200s. Furthermore, the friars functioned as a bridge between high-level papal policy and local municipal law, ensuring that the restrictive decrees of the Roman Curia were translated into the Swiss vernacular and enforced by the town bailiffs. They spearheaded the public burning of heretical texts and conducted high-profile disputations intended to prove the obsolescence of the old law in the face of Christian revelation. This sustained campaign of public agitation created a climate of psychological insecurity for the Jewish families, as their residences, once seen as symbols of stone-built stability, were now portrayed as nests of avarice and spiritual contagion. The presence of the mendicant preachers in Basel thus marked the definitive end of the pragmatic golden age of integration, replacing the transactional peace of the city with a permanent, state-sponsored anxiety that would serve as the foundational tinder for the later massacres and eventual expulsion. The promulgation of the canons of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, under the pontificate of Innocent III, established a standardized ecclesiastical framework for the social and physical demarcation of Jewish populations across Western Christendom. Canon 68 of the Council specifically mandated that Jews of both sexes be distinguished from the Christian populace by a difference in dress, a measure ostensibly designed to prevent accidental interfaith carnal relations and to ensure the perpetual visibility of their subordinate status. In the Swiss territories, which fell under the jurisdictional oversight of the powerful dioceses of Constance, Basel, and Sion, the implementation of these decrees was not instantaneous, but evolved through a series of provincial synods and municipal ordinances throughout the 13th century. The primary visual signifier adopted in the Sau, Rhine, and Aare regions was the Judenhut, a distinctive pointed hat, typically yellow or white, which became a mandatory legal requirement for Jewish males appearing in public marketplaces or civic squares. The enforcement of this visual stigma was codified in the Swiss context by the 1225 Provincial Synod of Mainz, which oversaw the ecclesiastical administration of the northern Swiss city-states. This synod dictated that the failure to wear the identifying headgear would result in immediate financial penalties or the forfeiture of protection rights, effectively transforming the Jewish residents' attire into a tool of municipal surveillance. While the Judenhut served as the initial marker, later decades saw the introduction of the yellow ring or badge, known as the rota, which was required to be affixed to the outer garment over the breast. In cities like Zurich and Bern, these regulations were integrated into the Stadtrecht, city law, signifying a transition where the responsibility for religious segregation moved from the local clergy to the secular bailiffs and guild masters. This administrative shift ensured that the Jewish community remained a visible minority, a status that facilitated the systematic policing of their interactions with Christian artisans and domestic servants. The legal objective of these markers was the erasure of social ambiguity. By physically labeling the Judei proprii, the authorities reinforced the theological narrative of the alien within the urban fabric. The mandatory dress code functioned as a visual revocation of the earlier, more integrated era of the 12th century, creating a psychological barrier that preceded the physical walls of the later ghettos. For the Jewish financiers of Basel and the scholars of Zurich, the hat and the ring acted as perpetual indicators of their legal vulnerability, reminding the Christian populace that these individuals existed outside the protective sacraments of the Church. This legislative demarcation also had profound economic implications, as the conspicuous nature of the Jewish dress made creditors easily identifiable and targeted during periods of civil unrest or economic downturns. Furthermore, the Swiss implementation of the Lateran decrees coincided with the rising influence of the municipal courts, which utilized the difference in dress to justify the exclusion of Jews from certain civic honors and guild participation. The Judenhut thus became an emblem of civic disenfranchisement, a tangible proof that the servant of the chamber possessed no claim to the evolving rights of the Swiss burgesses. The gradual and systematic enforcement of these identifying marks throughout the mid-13th century provided the necessary social preparation for more aggressive exclusionary policies. By the time the political crisis of 1298 emerged, the Jewish population of the Swiss city-states had already been subject to decades of state-mandated visual marginalization, a process that rendered them readily identifiable victims for the subsequent waves of populist violence. This chapter of Swiss history illustrates how centralized papal dogma was successfully translated into local municipal practice, ensuring that the Jewish presence was perpetually characterized by a state-sanctioned and visually enforced otherness. The historical trajectory of the Bernese Jewry was irrevocably altered in 1294 through the emergence of the ritual murder accusation, an administrative and judicial catalyst that transformed latent social friction into state-sanctioned lethal persecution. This event, centered on the discovery of the body of a young Christian boy named Rudolph, provided the necessary legal pretext for the municipal authorities of Bern to suspend the traditional protections afforded to the Judei propri. Unlike spontaneous mob violence, the Bern incident was characterized by a formalized judicial process wherein the city council, or RAT, assumed direct prosecutorial authority, effectively bypassing the oversight of the Habsburg Regency. The accusation posited that the Jewish community had collectively engaged in the ritualized killing of the child, a narrative that effectively criminalized the entire religious minority and permitted the state to initiate a systematic investigation of the Jewish quarter. The judicial proceedings were defined by the application of tortura, or judicial torture, used to extract confessions that aligned with the prevailing theological myth of the blood libel. These coerced testimonies were recorded as official evidence in the municipal archives, lending the proceedings a veneer of legal legitimacy that was used to justify the subsequent mass executions. Historians note that the 1294 trial was the first instance in the Swiss region where the secular municipal government, rather than ecclesiastical courts, led the prosecution of a religious crime, signifying a consolidation of civic power over the resident Jewish population. Following the extracted confessions, a significant portion of the Bernese Jewish community was condemned to death, with many individuals executed through public incineration at the stake. This act of state violence served a dual purpose. It satisfied the demands of a radicalized Christian populace while simultaneously enabling the municipal treasury to initiate the sequestration of the victims' substantial assets. The fiscal consequences of the 1294 incident were immediate and profound, as the municipal council utilized the conviction of the community to declare a moratorium on all outstanding debts owed to Jewish creditors. By legally designating the Jewish population as murderers of a Christian child, the city of Bern effectively invalidated the credit contracts held by its own burgesses and noble debtors. This systematic erasure of liabilities provided the city with a significant economic windfall, allowing the local elite to recoup the capital that had been used to fund earlier municipal expansion. The seizure of immovable property followed the executions, with the stone residences in the Jewish quarter being transferred to the ownership of the city or granted to loyal Christian patricians. This process of expropriation was not a byproduct of the violence, but a primary objective of the municipal administration, which sought to resolve the city's mounting fiscal deficits through the total liquidation of the Jewish presence. Furthermore, the 1294 incident established a dangerous legal precedent that was rapidly disseminated to other Swiss cities, including Zurich and Lucerne. The Bernese model demonstrated that an accusation of ritual murder could be utilized as an effective instrument of state policy to bypass the constraints of imperial law and achieve the total removal of financial intermediaries. Although King Adolf of Nassau later intervened to restore order and demand restitution for the surviving Jewish families. The social contract of the mid-13th century was permanently shattered. The memory of the 1294 executions remained embedded in the civic identity of Bern, eventually leading to the creation of the monumental Kindle Fresserbrunnen, or Ogre Fountain, which served as a perpetual visual reinforcement of the ritual murder myth. The Bern incident thus functioned as the essential psychological and legal preparation for the 1298 total expulsion, proving that the legal status of the Jewish community could be revoked at the discretion of the municipal councils if a suitable religious crisis was engineered. The transition from the judicial executions of 1294 to the permanent social marginalization of the Swiss Jewry was solidified through the intentional sacralization of the alleged victim, a process that transformed the child Rudolph into a local martyr saint. This hagiographical project was spearheaded by the Bernese clerical establishment, which recognized that the long-term preservation of the municipal property seizures required a religious justification that transcended the temporary nature of a criminal trial. The body of the youth was interred with high honors within the Berner Münster, the city's primary ecclesiastical center, where an altar was dedicated specifically to his veneration. This act of cult creation served to institutionalize the ritual murder myth, moving it from the realm of secular accusation into the non-negotiable sphere of public liturgy. By granting the victim a place within the local sacred geography, the authorities ensured that any future defense of the Jewish community would be framed as an affront to a recognized holy figure, effectively silencing legal dissent through the threat of sacrilege. The propaganda apparatus utilized to sustain the cult of little Rudolph relied on the systematic dissemination of miraculous narratives which were integrated into the sermons and prayer cycles of the Rhine and Ahr dioceses. These accounts, often recorded in the Chronica de Brno, portrayed the child not as a victim of a common crime, but as a sacrificial surrogate for the Christian faith, a narrative that mirrored the central themes of the Passion. The veneration of his remains as relics provided a physical focal point for popular religious fervor, drawing pilgrims from the surrounding rural districts who were instructed that the Jewish presence was a direct and active threat to the sanctity of Christian childhood. This devotional framework successfully redirected the socio-economic anxieties of the populace toward a perpetual religious vigil, ensuring that the initial wave of municipal hostility was maintained at a high emotional intensity for years following the actual event. Furthermore, the clerical promotion of the cult functioned as a mechanism for communal absolution, transforming the moral burden of the 1294 executions into a righteous act of religious defense. The local clergy utilized the martyrdom to justify the continued exclusion of Jews from the moral economy of the town, arguing that their ongoing presence would desecrate the ground where the martyrs' blood had supposedly been shed. This theological barrier prevented the restoration of residency rights even during periods of relative political stability, as the municipal council remained bound by the will of the saint to uphold the exclusionary status quo. The cult also influenced the development of the Passionsspiele, or passion plays, within the Swiss cantons, where the ritual murder accusation was dramatized for the illiterate masses, embedding the blood libel into the subconscious cultural identity of the region. The institutionalization of the cult of Rudolph was particularly significant because it lacked official papal canonization, yet functioned as a de facto state religion within the city-state of Bern. This autonomy allowed the local administration to maintain a unique, localized anti-Jewish fervor that was less susceptible to the moderating influences of the Roman Curia, or the Holy Roman Emperor. The altar and the associated liturgical ceremonies remained active features of the Bernese minster until the Reformation, providing a continuous ideological anchor for the policy of displacement. By weaponizing the memory of the singular 1294 tragedy, the clerical authorities created a durable engine of mass religious fervor that rendered the return of the Jewish community politically and socially impossible. This process of sacralization ensured that the final expulsion of 1298 was not viewed as an administrative innovation, but as the final, necessary step in the purification of a land already consecrated by the blood of the martyr. The financial destabilization of the Swiss knightly class during the late 13th century functioned as a primary, though often obscured, driver for the judicial mobilization against the Jewish community in Bern. This era was characterized by a widening disparity between the static, agrarian-based, seigneurial revenues of the lesser nobility and the rapidly increasing costs associated with the maintenance of knightly status, including the procurement of advanced military equipment and the upkeep of fortified residences. As the Swiss economy transitioned toward a monetary system, the Bernese ministeriales found their traditional land-based wealth increasingly ill-suited for the demands of urban politics and imperial military obligations. This fiscal entrapment necessitated a heavy reliance on Jewish credit, with the local nobility utilizing their ancestral estates as collateral for substantial liquid advances. By the early 1290s, the accumulation of debt within the knightly class had reached a point of systemic crisis, where the threat of foreclosure by Jewish creditors posed an existential risk to the territorial holdings of the most prominent noble families. The sudden emergence of ritual murder accusations in 1294 provided these noble debtors with a sophisticated mechanism for the unilateral cancellation of their financial liabilities. Historical analysis of the Bernese debt registries from this period reveals a direct correlation between the individuals presiding over the trial of the Jewish community and those who held the most significant outstanding loans. The municipal council, which directed the prosecution, was comprised of patricians and knights whose primary objective was the restoration of their own fiscal sovereignty through the systematic removal of their creditors. By framing the Jewish financiers as perpetrators of a religious crime, the nobility successfully invoked the legal principle of crimen lese majestatis, which permitted the state to nullify all existing contracts held by the accused. This judicial maneuvering transformed the blood libel from a theological dispute into a pragmatic instrument of debt relief, allowing the Bernese elite to clear their ledgers without the transfer of specie. Furthermore, the execution of the Jewish community enabled the wholesale redistribution of pledged lands back into the hands of the knightly families. The confiscated debt books were essentially treated as trophies of the trial, with the physical destruction of these records serving as the definitive signifier of noble liberation from the credit market. This process of expropriation allowed the nobility to consolidate their rural manors and urban residences, effectively reestablishing the traditional feudal order through the calculated application of state-sponsored violence. The Bernese nobility's support for the expulsion was therefore not merely an expression of religious zeal, but a strategic effort to insulate their class from the competitive pressures of the burgeoning mercantile economy. The immediate aftermath of the 1294 incident saw a stabilization of knightly fortunes at the direct expense of the Jewish minority, creating a powerful precedent for the totalizing expulsion of 1298. This convergence of aristocratic insolvency and judicial aggression remains a central fact in the dismantling of the Swiss Jewish presence, proving that the survival of the medieval nobility was inextricably linked to the periodic liquidation of their financial intermediaries. The election of Rudolf Thumbers of Habsburg as King of the Romans in 1273 initiated a fundamental reconfiguration of the political and legal architecture of the Swiss plateau, transitioning Jewish protection from a localized Kaiserburg heritage into a centralized instrument of Habsburg imperial policy. Prior to this ascension, the Jewish communities of the Aargau and Zurich districts operated under a fragmented landscape of regional bailiwicks. However, Rudolf's consolidation of the Kaiserburg and Lenzburg inheritances allowed the Habsburg dynasty to claim a near monopoly over the Judenregal in central Helvetia. This territorialization of the Juri regal meant that the residency rights and tax obligations of the Jewish population were no longer merely municipal concerns, but were integrated into the broader strategic requirements of the emerging Habsburg state. Rudolf utilized the legal doctrine of imperial ownership to transform these communities into a movable fiscal reservoir, specifically designed to underwrite the high costs of his military campaigns against the Przemyslid dynasty and the rebellious Swiss forest cantons. The Habsburg administrative shift was characterized by the introduction of the Reichssteuer, a general imperial tax levied with increasing frequency during the 1280s. Unlike the earlier transactional protection fees, these Habsburg levies were often assessed as a percentage of the community's total liquid assets, forcing Jewish financiers to liquidate long-term credit bonds to satisfy immediate royal demands. This fiscal intensification was formalized in the 1286 decree, which categorized all Jewish property within the empire, including the substantial holdings in Basel and Zurich, as subject to direct royal sequestration if tax quotas remained unmet. By asserting that the Judei proprii were essential assets of the imperial chamber, Rudolf I effectively stripped the Swiss city-states of their ability to negotiate separate financial terms with their resident Jews, centralizing the economic benefits of their presence within the Habsburg chancellery. This policy created a structural tension between the central crown and the local Swiss municipalities, as the towns viewed the heavy Habsburg taxation as a drain on the capital available for local public works. Furthermore, the consolidation of Habsburg power in the Alpine Rhine Valley necessitated the construction of a vast network of toll stations and fortified bridgeheads, projects that were frequently funded through the forced gifts and extraordinary loans mandated by the royal court. The Jewish community's role as the primary underwriters of the Habsburg military administrative complex ensured their safety in the short term, but it simultaneously bound their fate to the stability of a single dynasty. Rudolf's administration established a professionalized class of Reichsvögte, or imperial bailiffs, whose primary directive was the rigorous collection of these dues, often utilizing the threat of imprisonment to ensure compliance. This heightened level of state intervention eroded the traditional communal autonomy of the Swiss aljamas, as the internal judicial rulings of the rabbinical courts were increasingly superseded by the fiscal priorities of the Habsburg treasury. The death of Rudolf I in 1291 and the subsequent rise of the Old Swiss Confederacy created a power vacuum that further jeopardized the Jewish position. The forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, in their pursuit of Reichs- und Mittelbarkeit, imperial immediacy, viewed the Jewish populations of the pro-Habsburg cities as extensions of the very dynastic authority they sought to overthrow. The protection that had once been a legal shield under Rudolf became a political liability as the Swiss lands descended into a protracted conflict between Habsburg loyalists and the proponents of cantonal independence. By the close of the 13th century, the Habsburg consolidation had effectively monetized Jewish residency to its maximum capacity, leaving the community with diminished capital reserves and no reliable protector during the volatile transition to the reign of Albert the Mur. This period of intense fiscalization and territorial consolidation thus served as the essential precursor to the 1298 crisis, as the Jewish community had been transformed from an integrated urban asset into a purely extracted imperial resource. The transformation of the traditional jury regal into a systematic revenue stream reached its operational peak during the final decade of the 13th century, as the Habsburg administration under Albert the Mur formalized the jury tax as a primary mechanism for funding imperial statecraft. This period was defined by the transition from customary protection fees to the Goldener Opferpfennig, a specialized capitation tax that required every Jewish individual over the age of 12 to contribute an annual sum of 1 gold florin directly to the imperial treasury. In the Swiss territories, this tax was not merely a symbol of theological subordination, but functioned as a critical source of liquid specie used to mobilize mercenary infantries and procure siege engines for the protracted conflict against the nascent Swiss Confederacy. The Habsburg Chancellery utilized the detailed census data maintained by the Reichsvögte to project tax yields, effectively treating the Jewish populations of Bern, Zurich, and Basel as a securitized asset that could be leveraged to offset the declining feudal dues from the rebellious Alpine hinterlands. The fiscalization of protection shifted the legal emphasis from the safety of the subject to the solvency of the crown, leading to the implementation of the Bede, or extraordinary assessment, which targeted the accumulated capital of Jewish mercantile houses. During the 1290s, as the military pressure from the forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden intensified, the Habsburgs intensified their demands for forced loans that were essentially unredeemable advances against future protection. This practice eroded the liquidity of Swiss Jewish financiers, forcing them to call in outstanding debts from local Christian artisans and guilds at precisely the moment when the regional economy was contracting due to the ongoing civil strife. The resulting credit crunch in the Rhine Valley was a direct consequence of Habsburg military spending, as the capital that had previously circulated within the municipal building markets was diverted into the imperial war chest. This created a corrosive economic environment where the Jewish community was viewed by the Christian populace as a primary agent of royal extortion, despite their own status as the primary victims of the crown's fiscal predation. The administration of these taxes was managed through the Reichskammer, which established a network of fiscal agents specialized in the auditing of Jewish debt books to identify untapped reservoirs of wealth. These agents were empowered to seize communal property if the aggregate tax quota of a city's aljama was not satisfied, a policy of collective liability that incentivized the municipal councils to cooperate with imperial extraction. By making the city-states responsible for the collection of the Jewry tax, the Habsburgs effectively turned the Swiss municipal governments into the instruments of their own financial marginalization. The revenue derived from these levies was specifically earmarked for the construction of fortified depots along the Gotthard and Brunig passes, infrastructure that was essential for the Habsburgs to maintain their grip on the transalpine trade routes. Consequently, the Jewish community became the invisible financiers of the very military machine that was increasingly resented by the local Swiss population. The protection they purchased was no longer a guarantee of physical security, but had become a purely transactional residency permit that was subject to immediate revocation if the imperial treasury found more profitable alternatives. This systemic fiscalization removed the moral and customary constraints that had previously moderated royal demands, replacing them with a cold, mathematical assessment of the community's remaining extracted value. As the 1290s progressed, the Jewish residents of the Swiss plateau found themselves in a state of structural insolvency, having been drained of the capital necessary to sustain their social standing or to repurchase the protection of the crown during the catastrophic upheavals of 1298. This period of intense monetary extraction thus finalized the transition of the Swiss Jewry from an integrated urban class into a hollowed-out fiscal resource, an administrative status that rendered them expendable once the Habsburgs secured alternative lines of credit from Italian and southern German banking interests. The late 13th century in the Swiss city-states was characterized by a fundamental shift in municipal power dynamics, as the Zunfte, or craft guilds, transitioned from purely vocational associations into potent political blocs capable of challenging the traditional patrician elite. This period of guild revolutions saw the artisan classes in Zurich, Basel, and Bern demand a formal role in the Kleiner Rat and Grosser Rat municipal councils, a movement that directly threatened the established symbiotic relationship between the old nobility and the Jewish financiers. As the guilds consolidated their authority, they sought to establish total economic monopolies over their respective trades, viewing the flexible commercial activities of the Jewish minority as an illegitimate circumvention of the nascent guild system. The political program of the Swiss Zunfte was predicated on the principle of the exclusive right to work, which aimed to categorize any non-guild commercial activity as a threat to the stability of the urban middle class. The primary mechanism for this exclusion was the implementation of the Zunftordnungen, or Guild Ordinances, which formally prohibited Jews from participating in retail trade, manual crafts, and the direct purchase of raw materials in the public marketplaces. While the Jewish community had traditionally operated in the high-level credit market, the economic downturn of the 1290s had forced many individuals into smaller-scale pawnbroking and the trade of second-hand goods, areas that brought them into direct competition with Christian smiths, tailors, and tanners. The guilds successfully lobbied for municipal laws that required all commercial transactions to take place within the Kaufhaus, public warehouse, where guild officials could monitor prices and enforce the exclusion of non-members. These regulations effectively stripped the Jewish community of its ability to diversify its income, confining them to a narrowing corridor of financial services that were becoming increasingly dangerous as public resentment over debt intensified. Furthermore, the rise of the guilds introduced a new layer of municipal protectionism that targeted the alien status of the Judei proprii. The artisan classes argued that the imperial privileges protecting Jewish lenders were an unfair subsidy that disadvantaged the local Christian taxpayer. This political rhetoric was particularly effective in Zurich, where the guild masters utilized the municipal council reform to pass legislation that limited the legal recourse of Jewish creditors against guild members. By redefining the city's legal identity around the interests of the Zunft member, the Swiss towns created a constitutional environment where the Jewish resident was no longer an integrated fiscal partner, but a structural obstacle to the common good. The guilds also spearheaded the effort to prohibit Jews from employing Christian domestic servants or owning agricultural land in the urban periphery, measures designed to isolate the community and ensure they remained a socially and economically distinct caste. The political victory of the guilds meant that the municipal councils were no longer comprised of the traditional protectors of the Jewish community, but of its primary economic rivals. This transition was pivotal, as the guild-dominated councils were far more responsive to populist demands for debt relief and religious segregation than the earlier patrician administrations. In Basel, the growing power of the Zunft leaders led to the enactment of the 1297 ordinances, which restricted Jewish residents to specific streets and prohibited them from appearing in the central markets on Christian feast days. This legislative erosion of Jewish commercial freedom was a calculated preparation for the totalizing administrative removal of 1298. The rise of the Swiss guilds thus provided the organizational and ideological framework necessary to transform localized economic envy into a comprehensive state policy of exclusion, ensuring that the Jewish community lost its political standing just as it was being depleted of its financial capital. The year 1297 marked a critical constitutional impasse in the Swiss territories, as the long-standing jurisdictional struggle between the prince-bishops and the secularizing municipal councils reached a terminal phase. In Basel and Constance, the Judenregel, the legal right to tax and protect Jewish subjects, became the primary theater of conflict for regional sovereignty. Historically, the Bishop of Basel held this prerogative as an imperial fief, utilizing the Jewish community as a direct source of episcopal revenue and administrative support. However, by the late 13th century, the Rising Secular Council, or RAT, sought to categorize the Jewish population as municipal subjects rather than ecclesiastical property. This transition was not motivated by a desire for integration, but by a strategic attempt to seize the Jewry tax for the city's own military and infrastructural expenditures. The legal friction of 1297 centered on the overlapping demands for watch and ward, service, and emergency levies. The municipal councils began to unilaterally impose civic taxes on Jewish residents, effectively ignoring the traditional immunities granted by the bishop's chancellery. This created a state of legal paralysis where the Jewish community was subjected to double taxation and conflicting judicial orders. Compliance with episcopal mandates was increasingly interpreted by the secular bailiffs as an act of municipal treason. In the Statuta Civitatis of 1297, Basel's secular authorities formalized their claim to the internal policing of the Jewish quarter, explicitly challenging the bishop's traditional role as the singular guarantor of the Friedensgebot, or the command of peace. This institutional fragmentation stripped the Jewish minority of their primary defensive shield, as the bishop's waning seigneurial power proved insufficient to enforce imperial protection against the city's autonomous legal innovations. This geopolitical struggle turned the Jewish communities into passive pawns in a broader effort to achieve Reichsunmittelbarkeit, or imperial immediacy, for the Swiss towns. To weaken the bishop's fiscal base, the municipal councils often encouraged the Christian populace to withhold payments on debts held by episcopal agents, many of whom were prominent Jewish financiers. By delegitimizing the bishop's financial intermediaries, the secular elite successfully eroded the economic foundation of the prince-bishopric. This climate of administrative instability was mirrored in Zurich, where the city council utilized the 1297 territorial disputes with the Habsburg bailiffs to declare its own jurisdiction over all inhabitants within the walls, regardless of previous imperial or ecclesiastical charters. The consequence of this jurisdictional vacuum was a profound decay in the physical security of the Jewish quarters. As the bishop and the council contested the right to collect protection money, neither body assumed the actual responsibility for maintaining order during the escalating social unrest. The territorialization of the Jewish population meant that their residency was no longer a matter of stable imperial law, but a variable of local power politics. By the end of 1297, the institutional barriers that had historically moderated popular aggression were effectively dismantled. The Jewish families of the Rhine Valley found themselves legally isolated, trapped between an ecclesiastical authority that could no longer protect them and a secular municipal council that viewed them purely as a taxable resource to be exploited or discarded. This administrative fracture provided the necessary structural conditions for the Rindfleisch movement to penetrate the Swiss borders in the following year, as the competing authorities were more concerned with asserting their respective sovereignties than with upholding the collective safety of their most vulnerable subjects. The catastrophic failure of the prince-bishops to safeguard the Jewish communities under their jurisdiction was a direct consequence of the widening chasm between de jure imperial authority and the de facto military capabilities of the ecclesiastical states. Historically, the Bishop of Basel and the Bishop of Constance operated as the primary legal intermediaries for the Judei Propri, issuing salvus conductus, safe conduct, documents that theoretically rendered any assault on a Jewish resident a capital offense against the Church. However, by 1298, the traditional episcopal vogt, bailiff, had lost the executive power necessary to intervene within the densely populated urban cores, where the secular guilds possessed superior numbers and localized logistical control. The protection offered by the high clergy was effectively localized to the episcopal palace or cathedral precinct, leaving the Jewish quarters, located in the commercial districts, vulnerable to the tactical surrounding by municipal militias. The institutional fragility was compounded by the personal financial entanglement of the high clergy with the secular municipal elite. Many Swiss bishops were themselves heavily indebted to the very town councils that were agitating for the removal of Jewish residents, creating a conflict of interest that paralyzed episcopal decision-making during the early stages of mob mobilization. In Basel, the episcopal administration's reliance on municipal tax farming to satisfy its own imperial obligations meant that the bishop could not aggressively oppose the council's exclusionary measures without risking total fiscal insolvency. This dependency transformed the guarantor of peace into a silent observer, as the legal mandates for protection were systematically ignored by the city's bailiffs. The 1298 massacres demonstrated that the parchment of an episcopal charter possessed no defensive value when the secular authority refused to deploy the city's torwash, gate guards, to repel an advancing mob. Furthermore, the internal cohesion of the ecclesiastical hierarchy was eroded by the radicalized lower clergy and the mendicant orders, who often acted in direct opposition to the official episcopal policy of protection. While the prince-bishops sought to maintain the Jewish community as a stable revenue source, the parish priests and friars frequently provided the theological justification for the violence, framing the bishop's protection as a form of spiritual complicity with usury. This internal schism meant that the bishop could no longer rely on the moral authority of the pulpit to suppress urban unrest. In several instances during the 1290s, episcopal attempts to punish rioters were met with threats of excommunication against the bishop himself by local clerical factions, revealing the total breakdown of the traditional chain of command within the Swiss dioceses. The failure of the bishop's protection also manifested in the physical abandonment of the Judengassen during the 1298 riots. Despite the existence of the Friedensgebot, command of peace, the episcopal castles and fortified monasteries remained closed to Jewish refugees, a departure from earlier medieval precedents of sanctuary. The administrative paralysis of the episcopal courts ensured that survivors of localized attacks had no legal venue for restitution, as the bishop's itinerant justices were frequently denied entry into the secularized towns. This systematic withdrawal of support finalized the legal isolation of the Swiss jury, confirming that the servant of the chamber status had become an empty legal category. The collapse of episcopal protection thus served as the final administrative prerequisite for the massacres. By demonstrating that the highest authority in the region was powerless to act, the municipal councils were emboldened to proceed with the total liquidation of the Jewish presence, without fear of imperial or ecclesiastical retribution. The catastrophic violence of 1298 was initiated not within the Swiss city-states themselves, but through an external populist insurgency originating in the Franconian town of Röttingen, known as the Rindfleisch movement. This upheaval was led by a minor nobleman or butcher identified as Lord Rindfleisch, who claimed a divine mandate to avenge an alleged desecration of the host. Unlike the localized ritual murder charges of previous decades, the Rindfleisch movement introduced the host desecration myth as a primary psychological driver, a narrative that suggested the Jewish community was engaged in a systematic physical assault on the consecrated elements of the Eucharist. This accusation shifted the focus of anti-Jewish agitation from the domestic sphere of the family toward a perceived existential threat to the central sacrament of the Catholic Church. The movement functioned as a decentralized paramilitary force, mobilizing thousands of Judenschläger, Jew beaters, from the lower nobility and the urban poor who operated beyond the constraints of traditional feudal law. The rapid dissemination of the Rindfleisch massacres across Franconia, Bavaria, and Austria was facilitated by the terminal political instability of the Holy Roman Empire during the conflict between Adolf of Nassau and Albert I of Habsburg. The collapse of central imperial authority meant that there was no mobile executive force capable of suppressing the itinerant mobs as they moved through the Rhine Valley. By the summer of 1298, the violence had reached the northern borders of the Swiss territories, with the massacres in Nuremberg and Rothenburg serving as immediate precursors to the outbreaks in Basel and Zurich. The Rindfleisch movement operated on a logic of collective extermination, demanding that communities either undergo immediate baptism or face public execution. This external pressure acted as a radicalizing agent for the Swiss municipal councils, which found their own efforts at legal segregation superseded by the arrival of a foreign, uncontainable mob. The spillover effect into the Swiss Rhine regions was characterized by a tactical synchronization between the advancing Rindfleisch supporters and the local Swiss guild militias. In towns like Schaffhausen and St. Gallen, the approach of the Franconian mobs provided the necessary cover for local artisans to initiate their own purges, framing the violence as a proactive defense against the desecrators. The arrival of the movement in northern Switzerland effectively dismantled the final remnants of the Friedensgebot, command of peace, as the municipal authorities recognized that the defense of the Jewish quarter would require a military confrontation with a popular, religiously motivated insurgency. For the Jewish families of Zurich and Basel, the Rindfleisch movement represented the final failure of the imperial protection system. The crown was too preoccupied with dynastic warfare to protect its servants of the chamber from a trans-regional massacre. The impact of the Rindfleisch massacres on the Swiss expulsion was definitive, as it transformed the Jewish presence from a managed economic resource into a permanent security liability. The municipal councils in Bern and Zurich, witnessing the total destruction of communities in neighboring regions, concluded that the legal removal of the Jewish population was the only means of restoring civic order while simultaneously securing the community's remaining assets. The violence of 1298 thus functioned as a destructive accelerant, compressing years of growing social friction into a singular, catastrophic summer. By the time the Rindfleisch movement had exhausted its momentum, the Jewish communities of the Swiss plateau had been decimated, leaving the survivors to face an administrative environment where their presence was no longer legally or physically tenable. The Rindfleisch massacres thus served as the violent bridge between the localized hostilities of the 1290s and the totalizing administrative edicts that finalized the Swiss expulsion. The transition from administrative exclusion to active military-style engagement within the urban fabric of Zurich occurred in September 1298, when the city's Jewish quarter became the site of a coordinated siege executed by the combined forces of the artisan guilds and elements of the Kunstafel patrician society. This localized escalation was characterized by a tactical departure from spontaneous mob violence, as the assailants utilized the city's own firefighting and construction equipment to breach the formidable masonry of the Domus Lapidei. These stone houses, which had historically functioned as defensive strongholds and private vaults, were systematically surrounded to prevent the egress of the inhabitants or the removal of liquid assets. The geography of the Zurich Jewry concentrated primarily along the narrow Brungasse near the administrative center of the Rathaus, rendered the community tactically vulnerable to a multi-pronged assault that utilized the city's topography to create a perimeter of containment. The siege was conducted with the implicit or active complicity of the municipal authorities, who effectively suspended the Burgfrieden, or city peace, for the duration of the assault. Rioters employed scaling ladders and heavy iron pikes typically reserved for municipal fortification work to target the upper-story solaria and timber galleries of the Jewish residences. Because the ground floors were often constructed with thick, windowless, sandstone walls to protect bullion reserves, the attackers focused on the weaker upper levels, utilizing incendiary devices to force the residents from the interior vaults. This use of fire was a calculated maneuver. While it risked spreading to adjacent Christian structures, it ensured the rapid capitulation of the families barricaded within. The 1298 Zurich riots resulted in the capture of a significant number of residents, many of whom were executed in the immediate vicinity of their homes, or taken to the Wellenberg Tower for further interrogation. Furthermore, the siege of the Zurich Jewry marked a definitive violation of the traditional right of sanctuary that had previously applied to the private domestic sphere of the Judei proprii. The municipal bailiffs, rather than dispersing the mob, often acted as coordinators for the inventorying of the property as the houses were breached. This coordination ensured that the bullion, jewelry, and parchment bonds found within the stone vaults were not lost to general looting, but were secured as communal assets for the city treasury. The tactical efficiency of the Zurich siege demonstrated that the stone architecture, which had for a century represented Jewish stability and integration, had been transformed into a lethal architectural trap. The failure of the Imperial Reichsvogt to deploy the castle garrison to break the siege confirmed that the central Habsburg authority had ceded the monopoly on violence to the local municipal factions. The systematic nature of the 1298 Zurich riots also served as a mechanism for the physical erasure of Jewish legal presence. As the stone houses were systematically occupied, the official family registries and internal communal documents were targeted for destruction, effectively terminating the multi-generational records of residency. The aftermath of the siege saw the permanent transfer of these primary urban plots to Christian guild masters and patricians, a demographic shift that was finalized through the municipal council's refusal to permit the return of the survivors. The 1298 siege of Zurich thus represents the transition of the anti-Jewish movement from a theological polemic to a successful urban military operation, establishing the physical and political foundation for the subsequent totalizing edicts of expulsion. This chapter of the conflict proved that even the most fortified private spaces of the Jewish elite were defenseless against the coordinated application of municipal resources and guild-driven paramilitary aggression. The operational priority of the 1298 Swiss urban riots transitioned from the physical containment of the Jewish population to the systematic identification and destruction of the instrumenta debitorum, the legal parchment bonds that constituted the primary evidence of Christian indebtedness. During the high-velocity assaults in Basel, Zurich, and Bern, the rioters, led by guild masters and lesser nobility, directed their initial aggression toward the communal and private chests where these financial instruments were secured. This was a calculated act of judicial arson, predicated on the medieval legal reality that the physical possession of a debt bond was the only means of enforcing a claim in the municipal or imperial courts. The destruction of these bipartite indentures, which were often written in Hebrew and Latin to satisfy both rabbinical and secular notarial standards, effectively neutralized the liquid wealth of the Jewish financiers. By incinerating these documents in public squares, the rioters did not merely engage in an act of symbolic defiance, but achieved a comprehensive, non-reversible cancellation of their collective financial obligations. The mechanics of these assaults targeted the arca, or the official strong chests, which were secured by multiple iron locks and traditionally held under the shared custody of Jewish and Christian officials. In the Swiss city-states, the vulnerability of these repositories was exacerbated by the breakdown of municipal oversight, as the very officials responsible for the security of the records were often the primary beneficiaries of their destruction. Once the chests were breached, the rioters prioritized the debt books over portable plunder, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the documentary nature of medieval credit. The parchment rolls and wax-sealed contracts were frequently subjected to public desecration before being committed to the flames, a ritualized form of social inversion that signaled the end of the creditor's legal standing. This systematic erasure of proof rendered the Jewish community legally invisible, as they could no longer produce the documentation required to petition the Reichsvogt or the municipal court for the recovery of their principal investments. Furthermore, the destruction of the ledgers served to destabilize the broader regional credit market, as the loss of secondary bonds and collateral agreements undermined the security of third-party investors. Many of the destroyed documents represented rehypothecated loans, where Jewish financiers had pledged their own debt claims to larger banking interests or the Habsburg crown. The physical liquidation of these bonds thus created a cascading failure of obligation that extended far beyond the city walls, effectively decoupling the Swiss urban economy from the trans-regional financial networks. The municipal councils, in the wake of the riots, often issued retroactive decrees that prohibited the reconstruction of debt records through oral testimony, a legislative maneuver that finalized the economic ruin of the survivors. This policy of documentary nullification ensured that the Jewish community lost not only their immediate capital, but also the future income streams that would have funded their legal defense or their eventual departure from the territories. The 1298 War on the Archives also manifested in the targeting of the internal communal records of the aljamas, which documented the internal taxation and asset distribution of the Jewish quarters. By destroying these communal ledgers, the rioters ensured that the city's subsequent confiscation of property could not be contested through appeals to prior ownership or inherited titles. The physical ashes of the Jewish debt books thus became the foundational material for a new, debt-free Swiss urban order, where the redistribution of property was unencumbered by the claims of the former inhabitants. The destruction of the debt ledgers represents the most pragmatic and strategically significant phase of the 1298 crisis, proving that the violence was not a spontaneous religious frenzy, but a deliberate administrative purge aimed at the total and permanent erasure of the financial liabilities of the Christian ruling class. This chapter of the expulsion demonstrates how the vulnerability of medieval parchment allowed for the rapid and total transformation of a society's economic structure through the tactical application of coordinated arson. The terminal phase of the 1298 massacres in the Swiss Rhine Valley was characterized by the imposition of a non-negotiable theological ultimatum that forced the Jewish communities of Basel, Schaffhausen, and Zurich to choose between immediate baptism or collective execution. This era of violence, catalyzed by the Rheinfleisch movement, operated under a binary logic where the mercy of the Church was extended only through the total renunciation of the Mosaic faith. For the Ashkenazi communities of the Swiss plateau, this crisis was addressed through the established halachic framework of Kiddush Hashem, or the sanctification of the name, a ritualized form of martyrdom that prioritized spiritual integrity over physical survival. Unlike spontaneous acts of self-destruction, the 1298 martyrdoms were often conducted as highly structured communal events led by rabbinical authorities who issued formal legal rulings regarding the conditions under which a Jew was required to accept death rather than undergo forced conversion. The implementation of Kiddush Hashem in the Swiss context was fundamentally shaped by the precedent of the 1096 First Crusade massacres in the Rhineland, which provided the ideological and liturgical templates for the 1298 victims. In Basel and Zurich, the communal leaders utilized the synagogue or the domestic stone vaults as the physical sites for these acts, ensuring that the final moments of the community were spent within consecrated or private spaces. Documentation from contemporary memorabilia, memorial books, indicates that many families chose to act proactively, performing ritualized killings of their own kin to prevent their capture and subsequent forced baptism by the advancing mobs. This practice was grounded in a specific interpretation of Jewish law that categorized the compulsory transition to Christianity as an act of spiritual annihilation, rendering the physical termination of life a preferable and sanctified outcome. The municipal records of the period, while often focusing on the fiscal redistribution of property, frequently noted the unyielding obstinacy of the Jewish residents who chose incineration within their homes over the baptismal font. Furthermore, the choice of forced baptism created a distinct, albeit smaller, social category of new Christians within the Swiss territories, individuals who were legally absorbed into the Christian body politic while remaining under intense social scrutiny. For many of the Swiss Judei propri, however, the prospect of conversion was viewed as a total loss of legal and social standing, as the servant of the chamber status did not automatically translate into the full rights of a Christian burgess. The theological choice was thus reinforced by a pragmatic assessment of the future. A converted Jew in 1298 Switzerland remained an alien whose wealth had already been sequestered and whose community had been dismantled. This environmental pressure ensured that the majority of the community opted for martyrdom, a decision that resulted in the near-total demographic liquidation of the established Swiss Jewries in a single season of violence. The institutional legacy of these martyrdoms was preserved through the Memorbuch tradition, which became the definitive record of the 1298 expulsion for the subsequent diaspora. These texts functioned as liturgical archives, listing the names of the sanctified and the specific locations of their deaths, thereby creating a transnational sacred geography of the Swiss Rhine. The public nature of these deaths, often involving mass drownings in the Rhine or collective burnings, provided the Christian populace with a visceral signifier of the total severance of the Jewish presence. By choosing Kiddush Hashem, the Swiss Jewish communities effectively withdrew themselves from the reach of municipal and imperial law, ensuring that their final act was one of religious autonomy. This chapter of the expulsion demonstrates that the 1298 crisis was not merely a fiscal or political event, but a profound theological collision where the Jewish community utilized the only remaining instrument of agency, the sanctification of their own lives, to protest the terminal failure of the Swiss social contract. The political paralysis of the Holy Roman Empire during the 1298 succession crisis created a catastrophic vacuum of central authority that fundamentally compromised the imperial guarantee of protection for the Jewish community. As Albert the Franz of Habsburg and Adolf of Nassau engaged in an exhaustive civil war for the crown, the administrative mechanisms of the Reichshofgericht, or the imperial court, were effectively suspended, leaving the servants of the chamber without a functional venue for legal appeal. The Battle of Gohlheim in July 1298, which resulted in the death of Adolf of Nassau, occupied the entirety of Albert I's military and diplomatic attention, precisely as the Rindfleisch movement and municipal purges reached their zenith in the Swiss territories. This physical absence of the monarch meant that the Reichsvogt, the imperial bailiff in the Swiss regions, lacked the military retinue necessary to suppress urban riots, as most imperial knights had been summoned to the Rhineland to secure the Habsburg succession. The unwillingness of the Habsburg administration to intervene was a calculated component of Albert III's broader strategy to secure municipal allegiance through the deliberate alienation of royal prerogatives. Recognizing that his legitimacy as king of the Romans depended upon the immediate support of the powerful Swiss city-states, Albert utilized the Jewish population as a political sacrifice to pacify the debt-ridden municipal councils of Bern, Zurich, and Basel. By permitting the city governments to execute the purges and seize communal assets, the Habsburg crown essentially sanctioned a transfer of liability where the political goodwill of the burgesses was prioritized over the long-term tax yield of the Judenregel. This policy turned the Jewish community into an expendable diplomatic currency. The Crown's silence functioned as a de facto grant of municipal sovereignty over the Jewish quarters, a concession that the cities had sought for decades to achieve territorial independence. Furthermore, the imperial chancellery's failure to act reflected a shift in Habsburg fiscal theory, which increasingly viewed the Jewish wealth reservoir as an exhausted and depreciating resource. Decades of extraordinary levies under Rudolf the Fur had already depleted the community's liquid capital, making the cost of a military intervention to protect them significantly higher than the projected future revenue they could provide to the treasury. Albert the Mern's administration transitioned toward the use of Italian and Southern German Christian banking houses for high-level finance, rendering the medieval Jewish credit model obsolete within the imperial budget. This economic pivot meant that the central government had no pragmatic incentive to uphold the Servitudo Camerae against the unified opposition of the Swiss guilds and patricians. The legal fiction of imperial ownership thus provided the crown with a mechanism to permit the liquidation of the Jewish presence without formally revoking their protected status. The subsequent imperial pardon issued by Albert the Mers to the cities of Zurich and Basel in 1299 confirmed this complicity. Rather than demanding the restoration of the Jewish communities or the return of their confiscated property, the emperor accepted a lump sum payment from the municipal treasuries as a settlement for the loss of his servants. This transaction formally legalized the results of the 1298 violence, transforming a series of illegal purges into a recognized, state-sanctioned relocation. The failure of imperial authority was therefore not an accidental breakdown of the state, but a deliberate political maneuver that finalized the transition of the Swiss Jewish community from royal subjects to municipal outcasts. By failing to appoint new bailiffs or enforce the Landfrieden, Albert allowed the municipal councils to finalize the expulsion through administrative default, permanently severing the ancient bond between the Habsburg crown and the Jewish inhabitants of the Alpine Rhine. The issuance of the 1298 expulsion edicts by the municipal councils of Bern and Zurich represented the definitive transition of Swiss anti-Jewish policy from spontaneous urban insurrection to a formalized, state-sanctioned administrative law. These decrees, processed through the Kanzleien of the respective city-states, functioned as the ultimate juridical mechanism for the total excision of the Jewish minority from the urban body politic. By codifying the results of the earlier massacres into binding municipal statutes, the councils of the Swiss plateau effectively transformed a period of lawless violence into a legitimate Rechtsakt that recognized no future right of return for the survivors. The Edict of 1298 was not merely a reaction to the Rindfleisch movement, but was a strategic consolidation of the guild-driven political shifts of the previous decades, utilizing the crisis of the Habsburg succession to permanently secure municipal sovereignty over the Jewish quarters. The administrative language of these mandates was characterized by its categorical focus on the Gemeiner Nutzen, or common good, a legal concept that allowed the secular authorities to override the traditional imperial protections of the Judae proprii. The edicts explicitly specified that the presence of the Jewish population was no longer compatible with the spiritual and economic health of the Christian burgesses, citing the recent theological upheavals and ritual. Murder allegations as proof of an irreconcilable social breach. Unlike the temporary bans of the mid-13th century, the 1298 decrees provided no mechanism for the renewal of residency permits, establishing a permanent territorial prohibition that would endure for centuries. This legislative finality was secured through the systematic revocation of all previous letters of protection, which were formally annulled and removed from the municipal archives to prevent any future legal contestation by the departing families. The execution of the edicts necessitated a rigorous administrative census, as the town bailiffs and guildmasters were tasked with identifying any individuals remaining in the subterranean vaults or private study halls of the Judengasse. The decrees established a rigid deadline for departure, typically coinciding with the feast of St. Michael, after which any Jewish person found within the city walls was subject to summary imprisonment or capital punishment. This temporal constraint was designed to facilitate an orderly but total evacuation, ensuring that the municipal treasury could proceed with the final inventorying of seized assets without the interference of the former owners. The 1298 edicts also addressed the status of outstanding obligations, decreeing that all Christian debts to the expelled community were to be paid directly into the city chest or declared null, effectively completing the financial reset that the rioters had initiated. Furthermore, the promulgation of the expulsion orders in Bern and Zurich served as a template for other Swiss territories, including Lucerne and St. Gallen, which adopted similar administrative protocols to purge their own urban cores. This regional synchronization transformed the expulsion from a series of isolated municipal events into a collective Swiss policy of demographic homogeneity. The formalization of the 1298 edicts thus marked the terminal collapse of the medieval Alpine social contract, replacing the multi-layered jurisdictional protections of the Roman and Carolingian legacies with a singular, exclusionary municipal law. By the time the final administrative sign-offs were recorded in the Ratsmanuale, the Jewish presence in the founding cities of the Confederacy had been legally and physically terminated. The 1298 decrees remain the definitive documentary record of this cultural excision, signifying the moment when the Swiss city-states utilized their emerging legislative autonomy to finalize the permanent removal of their ancient financial and religious minority. Following the issuance of the formal expulsion edicts, the Swiss municipal administrations initiated a systematic liquidation of Jewish immovable assets, a process that facilitated one of the most significant redistributions of urban property in the history of the Helvetian Plateau. This phase was defined by the mandatory conversion of high-value domus lapidae into liquid capital under conditions of extreme market distortion. Because the 1298 decrees imposed a rigid, non-negotiable deadline for departure, the departing Jewish families were forced to operate within a terminal buyer's market where the Christian burgesses possessed absolute leverage. The sudden influx of hundreds of premium stone residences into the relatively small real estate markets of Zurich, Bern, and Basel triggered an immediate and profound depression in property values. Houses that had previously served as high-level collateral for imperial loans were sold at fractions of their appraised worth, as potential purchasers recognized that the sellers had no legal alternative but to accept any offered sum before the mandatory evacuation date. The administrative oversight of these transactions was managed by the municipal Schatzmeister, treasurer, who implemented a system of controlled appraisals to ensure that the city's own interests were prioritized during the fire sale. These appraisals were frequently biased toward the purchasing Christian guilds and patrician families, effectively institutionalizing the devaluation of Jewish holdings. The municipal councils also imposed heavy exit taxes and transfer fees on these sales, ensuring that a significant portion of the remaining equity was siphoned into the city treasury before it could be carried across the border. This fiscal predation ensured that the Jewish community exited the Swiss territories in a state of profound financial depletion, while the municipal coffers received an immediate injection of capital and property titles. The real estate market's collapse was so thorough that many properties remained in a state of legal limbo for years, as the sheer volume of vacant stone structures exceeded the immediate occupancy needs of the burgeoning Christian middle class. The liquidation process also involved the formal cleansing of property titles through the revocation of all previous deeds and mortgage interests held by Jewish individuals. Once a sale was concluded under municipal duress, the city chancellery issued a liber emissionum, a new title deed that explicitly guaranteed the purchaser against any future claims by the former owners or their heirs. This legal finality was essential for the stability of the new urban order, as it decoupled the best residential plots in the city centers from their ancient Jewish associations. The stone houses, which had once functioned as the architectural anchors of the Jewish quarters, were rapidly integrated into the mainstream residential fabric of the Swiss towns. This demographic and structural shift allowed the rising guildmasters to occupy the former centers of finance, physically embodying the political victory of the artisan classes over the displaced minority. Furthermore, the immediate depression of the real estate market had a cascading effect on the broader Swiss economy, as the loss of Jewish-held mortgage capital reduced the overall creditworthiness of the urban centers. The transition from Jewish to Christian ownership was often accompanied by the physical repurposing of the interiors, with the former strong rooms and study halls being converted into commercial storage or domestic quarters. This methodical appropriation of the physical infrastructure of the Jewish community ensured that the 1298 expulsion was not just a human displacement, but a comprehensive asset transfer that underpinned the wealth of the Swiss patrician class for the subsequent century. The liquidation of 1298 thus finalized the transformation of the Swiss urban landscape into a demographically homogeneous and fiscally reset territory, where the physical remains of a centuries-old community were absorbed into the growing power of the independent city-states. The conclusion of the 1298 administrative purges necessitated the final jurisdictional resolution of the Jewish communal estate, which differed from private residential property in its status as the institutional heart of the Aljama. Following the totalizing edicts of the Swiss municipal councils, the Shola synagogue and the Beth Olam cemetery were categorized as vacant properties with no surviving legal claimants, allowing for their immediate escheat to the city treasuries. This seizure was formalized through the Ratsurteil, which declared that all buildings dedicated to non-Christian worship were henceforth the property of the Christian communitas. In Basel and Zurich, this process of expropriation was managed with high administrative precision. Synagogues were not merely abandoned, but were systematically deconsecrated and repurposed as secular or ecclesiastical halls. This structural conversion served an ideological purpose, physically demonstrating the supersession of the old law by the triumphant municipal order while providing the city councils with valuable, centrally located real estate for public administration. The architectural fate of the synagogues in the Swiss territories reflected the systematic erasure of Jewish cultural markers. In many instances, the interiors were stripped of liturgical furnishings, the Aron Kodesh and the Bima, which were often publicly burned or sold for the value of their raw materials. The buildings were then structurally altered, with the insertion of altars or the conversion of study halls into guild meeting rooms or parish administrative offices. This Christianization of the urban topography ensured that the former Jewish religious centers were integrated into the municipal landscape as symbols of the community's definitive absence. The ritual baths, or mikvaot, which were integral to the subterranean fabric of the Jewry, were frequently filled with rubble or converted into general-purpose water storage, effectively terminating the possibility of future ritual observance in the city. By repurposing these sites, the Swiss city-states ensured that the physical environment of the town center reflected the religious and political homogeneity mandated by the 1298 edicts. The treatment of the Jewish cemeteries outside the municipal walls represented the most profound act of communal desecration and asset recovery. Once the legal protection of the bishop or the Habsburg bailiff was revoked, these burial grounds were seized by the city councils and declared public land. The tombstones, many featuring centuries of Hebrew epigraphy, were treated as a source of cheap building material. They were frequently utilized in the construction of new defensive fortifications, municipal foundations, and even Christian residential masonry. This practice of spolia achieved a dual objective. It provided free stone for municipal infrastructure while simultaneously obliterating the ancestral records of the Jewish presence. In Basel, the destruction of the cemetery at the Spalenberg provided the raw material for the expansion of the city's defensive perimeter, effectively embedding the remains of the Jewish community into the very walls that would henceforth exclude them. Furthermore, the seizure of communal property included the confiscation of the Hekdesh, communal hospital, and the charity funds that had supported the community's poor. These liquid assets were absorbed into the city's Allmend, common fund, where they were redirected toward Christian welfare programs or the financing of local guilds. The systematic transfer of these institutional resources ensured that any potential returning Jews would find no infrastructure to support their resettlement. This policy of topographical purging finalized the work of the 1298 expulsion by removing the sacred and social anchors of the Jewish faith from the Swiss soil. The conversion of the synagogues and the erasure of the cemeteries turned the once vibrant Jewish quarters into generic urban zones, purged of their distinct identity and wholly subject to the new centralized municipal law. This chapter of the expulsion confirms that the 1298 crisis was an act of total cultural replacement, where the physical and religious legacy of a community was liquidated to consolidate the power of the emerging Swiss city-states. The physical removal of the Jewish population from the Swiss city-states following the autumn of 1298 was governed by the Salvi Conductus, a specialized administrative instrument of safe conduct that defined the logistical parameters of the forced march toward the northern and western borders. This document functioned as a mobile legal enclosure, extending municipal jurisdiction beyond the city walls to the highways, ensuring that the exiles remained under the direct supervision of the local sheriffs and bailiffs. The primary objective of the Salvi Conductus was not the welfare of the refugees, but the preservation of public order. The municipal councils sought to prevent the spillover of anti-Jewish violence into the rural hinterlands, which might disrupt the feudal agrarian economy or ignite secondary riots among the peasantry. Consequently, the march was organized into strictly regulated convoys, with the timing of departure and the selection of transit routes dictated by the Landvogt to avoid intersections with major market days or Christian liturgical processions. The financial burden of this state-supervised removal was borne entirely by the Jewish families, who were required to pay a convoy fee or Geleitsgeld for the provision of the armed guard. These guards, often comprised of municipal sergeants and lower-tier guild militias, acted as both protectors and jailers, preventing the refugees from disposing of any remaining assets or seeking sanctuary in peripheral villages. The logistics of the column were constrained by the 1298 edicts, which limited the exiles to carrying only what could be borne on the back or on a single pack animal, effectively precluding the transport of large-scale liquid capital or bulkier household goods. This mandated poverty on the road ensured that the exiles remained dependent on the escort for the procurement of rations and temporary shelter in designated Spitaler, or fortified inns along the Ahr and Rhine valleys. The role of the local sheriff during these stops was to maintain a strict quarantine of the column, preventing any commercial or social interaction between the exiles and the local Christian population. The path toward the northern borders often utilized the ancient Roman riparian roads, moving the survivors of the Bernese and Zurich purges toward the bridgeheads of the Rhine. Each territorial boundary required the presentation of the Salvi Conductus and the payment of additional transit tolls to the local seigneurial lords, further depleting the survivors' minimal resources. For the elderly and the infirm who had survived the initial urban sieges, the logistical rigor of the march functioned as a secondary filter of the population. Many did not survive the exposure to the early alpine winter, and their burials were often conducted in unmarked sites along the road, as the use of traditional Jewish cemeteries was now legally prohibited. The sheriff's final duty was to witness the physical crossing of the border, at which point the municipal protection was formally terminated and the Salvi Conductus was reclaimed by the Chancellery. This administrative closure marked the definitive end of the Jewish subjects' legal existence within the Swiss territories, leaving the refugees to navigate the high-risk zones of the neighboring bishoprics without the oversight of a recognized protector. The forced march of 1298 thus represented a highly professionalized operation of state-sanctioned displacement, where the tools of medieval law were utilized to ensure the efficient and total demographic cleansing of the Swiss interior. The transit across the Rhine River during the winter of 1298 marked the terminal phase of the Swiss displacement, As the refugees moved from the jurisdiction of the municipal councils into a fragmented landscape of foreign seigneurial and ecclesiastical territories. This crossing was primarily concentrated at strategic logistical nodes, such as the Ponts Reni in Basel and the ferry points near Schaffhausen, where the river functioned as a hydrographic and political frontier between the Swiss city-states and the Holy Roman Empire's broader German heartlands. The physical act of crossing was governed by the passagium, a specific transit toll levied by the bridge lords and ferry masters who controlled the riparian access points. For the survivors of the Swiss purges, the Rhine represented a definitive legal boundary. Once the northern bank was reached, the protection of the Swiss salvi conductus expired, and the exiles were subjected to the immediate fiscal demands of the Rhenish nobility, who viewed the incoming population as a source of immediate entry revenue rather than long-term residence. The demographic movement toward the Palatinate, or the Rheinpfalz, was dictated by the existence of the ancient Schum communities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, which, despite the recent Rindfleisch devastations, still possessed the skeletal infrastructure of Jewish life. However, the arrival of the Swiss refugees coincided with a period of intense instability in the Palatinate, as the local counts palatine were themselves engaged in the Habsburg-Nassau dynastic conflict. This meant that the refugees from Zurich and Bern were often denied entry into the larger urban centers and were forced into satellite settlements in the smaller market towns of the Neckar and Main valleys. The administrative records of the Palatinate from 1299 document a significant increase in the issuance of temporary toleration letters, which granted residency for fixed terms of 1 to 3 years in exchange for substantial upfront payments. This created a state of perpetual transience, where the Swiss exiles were effectively transformed into a mobile labor force of financiers and artisans with no permanent right of domicile. Parallel to the northern migration, a significant portion of the western Swiss Jewry, particularly those from the Aare Valley and Geneva, sought refuge in the county of Savoy under the administration of Amadeus IV. The Savoyard territories offered a fundamentally different legal environment than the Swiss city-states, as the Count of Savoy prioritized the economic utility of Jewish capital to fund his own territorial expansion into the Faucigny and the Bresse. In Savoy, the refugees were not subjected to the same guild-driven exclusionary pressures found in Bern. Instead, they were integrated into the ducal fiscal apparatus as finitores, or specialized accountants and tax farmers. The entry into Savoy involved the crossing of the Jura Mountains and the transit through the Genevan bridgeheads, where the refugees were required to register their remaining movable assets with the Savoyard bailiffs. This westward movement resulted in a demographic shift toward the cities of Chambéry and Turin, where the Swiss survivors contributed to the formation of a distinct Sapaudian Jewish identity that operated under more stable, albeit heavily taxed, ducal protections. The crossing of the Rhine thus functioned as a demographic centrifugal force, fracturing the once cohesive Swiss aljamas into dispersed fragments across the southern empire and the western Alps. The logistical difficulty of the winter crossing, combined with the predatory toll systems of the Rhenish lords, ensured that the exiles arrived in their new territories with almost no liquid capital, rendering them immediately dependent on the charity of established communities or the exploitative protection of new sovereigns. By the beginning of 1299, the Swiss Jewry, as a unified political and economic entity, had ceased to exist, replaced by a series of isolated refugee clusters navigating the precarious legal gaps of the medieval European frontier. This final geographical transition completed the work of the 1298 edicts, moving the Jewish presence from the central Alpine plateau to the peripheral zones of neighboring principalities, where their residency would remain conditional on the shifting fiscal requirements of the local nobility. The completion of the 1298 expulsion from the Swiss city-states immediately precipitated a period of profound monetary contraction and structural economic stagnation, an era analytically identified as the empty street syndrome. This phenomenon was characterized by the sudden disappearance of the only specialized class capable of providing large-scale liquid capital, creating a liquidity trap that paralyzed the burgeoning mercantile economies of Bern, Zurich, and Basel. While the municipal councils and noble debtors had achieved a short-term erasure of their financial liabilities through the destruction of debt ledgers, they simultaneously eliminated the very mechanism that allowed for the circulation of specie. The 1299 fiscal year saw a dramatic reduction in the frequency of market transactions, as the Christian artisan classes found themselves unable to secure the bridge loans necessary for the bulk procurement of raw materials such as Baltic timber, Mediterranean textiles, and Rhine Valley metals. The stagnation was most visible in the monumental building sectors, where the ambitious construction projects of the mid-13th century were forced into a state of indefinite suspension. Without the continuous influx of Jewish-held capital, the municipal treasuries could no longer meet the payroll demands of specialized stonemasons and architects, leading to the abandonment of cathedral nave extensions and defensive fortifications across the Swiss plateau. This cessation of public works triggered a cascading recession in the local labor market, as thousands of skilled and unskilled laborers were displaced from the urban cores. The empty street was thus both a literal reference to the vacated Jewish quarters and a metaphorical description of the silent construction sites and idle marketplaces. This period marked a regression toward a more static, agrarian-based economy, where wealth was once again locked in land tenure rather than operating as dynamic, transferable credit. Furthermore, the loss of the Jewry tax created a significant deficit in the municipal balance sheets, forcing the Swiss city-states to implement higher internal levies on their own burgesses to fund basic administrative functions. This shift in the tax burden eroded the political goodwill of the guild members who had initially supported the expulsion, as the promised debt-free prosperity was superseded by a climate of high taxation and capital scarcity. The Transalpine trade routes also suffered a measurable decline in volume, as the absence of Jewish financial intermediaries made it intervened for local merchants to settle cross-border accounts or insure their caravans against loss. The Swiss city-states, previously positioned as vital hubs in the Mediterranean Rhineland corridor, found themselves increasingly bypassed by southern German and Italian banking interests who viewed the unstable, capital-starved Swiss markets as high-risk environments. The economic landscape of 1299 was further defined by a monetary freeze, where the remaining silver bullion was hoarded by the patrician elite rather than reinvested into the urban infrastructure. This lack of reinvestment led to the physical decay of the recently acquired Jewish properties, which were often poorly maintained by their new Christian owners who lacked the liquid funds for structural repairs. The empty street syndrome thus signaled the definitive end of the rapid urban expansion that had defined the Zähringer and early Habsburg eras. It would take decades for the Swiss city-states to develop an indigenous Christian financial architecture to replace the lost Jewish credit networks, a period during which the regional economy remained localized, provincial, and structurally fragile. This chapter of the expulsion demonstrates that the administrative removal of a financial minority resulted in a self-inflicted economic contraction that hampered the political ambitions of the Swiss Confederacy for the remainder of the 14th century. The administrative consolidation of the 1298 expulsion was accompanied by the creation of the Judenschatz, a specialized municipal fund designated for the management and redistribution of the liquid assets and sequestered bullion seized from the former Jewish residents. While the broader urban economy experienced a period of contraction, the municipal treasuries of Bern, Zurich, and Basel utilized these immediate windfalls to resolve chronic fiscal deficits and to finance high-priority defensive requirements. The sequestration of portable wealth, including uncoined silver, jewelry, and imported luxury textiles, provided the Swiss city-states with a strategic reserve of specie that was independent of traditional agrarian tithes or guild dues. This capital was primarily utilized to settle the imperial pardon payments to Albert Thrufers of Habsburg, effectively using the Jewish community's own assets to purchase legal immunity for the municipal authorities who had executed the purges. By transferring these funds to the imperial chancellery, the Swiss towns successfully neutralized the threat of royal retribution while simultaneously securing the permanent legal title to all confiscated lands. Furthermore, the Jury Fund acted as a critical source of funding for the professionalization of municipal militias and the procurement of advanced military hardware required for territorial defense. During the transition into the early 14th century, the Swiss city-states utilized these liquidated assets to pay the wages of the Reisläufer precursors, mercenary infantries tasked with protecting the urban perimeters from the predatory territorial ambitions of the surrounding regional nobility. The specific application of these funds is recorded in the municipal Rechnungsbücher, account books, which document the allocation of Jewish silver for the reinforcement of river bridgeheads and the construction of new defensive watchtowers. This infrastructural expansion was essential for the towns to maintain their status as free imperial cities, as it allowed them to secure the transalpine transit routes that generated the tolls necessary to replace the lost jury tax. The redistribution also functioned as a sophisticated mechanism of political patronage, where the seized debt books were used to stabilize the loyalty of the artisan guilds. By declaring the municipal treasury as the legal successor to all outstanding Jewish credit claims, the councils were able to selectively enforce or nullify debts based on the political utility of the borrower. This selective debt management allowed the pro-expulsion factions within the council to grant fiscal amnesties to key supporters, effectively reordering the urban hierarchy through the calculated cancellation of liabilities. The wealth that had previously operated as dynamic, private capital was thus transformed into a static municipal resource, utilized to fund the construction of new market halls and granaries that served the common good of the Christian burgesses. The 1298 redistribution also facilitated the expansion of municipal welfare institutions such as the Bürgerspital, Citizens' Hospital, which absorbed the liquid endowments of the former Jewish charitable societies. This transfer of social capital ensured that the municipal authorities became the sole providers of public assistance, further centralizing power within the secular council. The jury fund thus provided the financial scaffolding necessary for the Swiss city-states to transition from fragmented feudal outposts into cohesive, autonomous political entities. By the time the immediate windfall had been exhausted, the Swiss towns had utilized the seized Jewish wealth to create a modernized urban infrastructure and a professionalized military apparatus that would underpin the sovereignty of the old Swiss Confederacy for the subsequent century. This chapter of the expulsion confirms that the removal of the Jewish community provided the primary capital injection required for the physical and political consolidation of the emerging Swiss cantonal system. The administrative finality of the 1298 expulsion was underscored by a comprehensive program of semiotic erasure, whereby the Swiss municipal and ecclesiastical authorities sought to physically expunge the visual and epigraphic evidence of Jewish residency from the urban fabric. This process of damnatio memoriae was designed to align the physical environment of cities like Bern and Zurich with the new, demographically homogeneous legal reality established by the expulsion edicts. Central to this effort was the systematic removal of Hebrew inscriptions from the facades of stone residences and communal buildings. Inscriptions that had once identified the lineage of financiers or the dedications of scholars were chiseled away or plastered over, effectively silencing the lithic record of the community's antiquity. This epigraphic excision was not merely an act of vandalism, but a state-sanctioned administrative requirement intended to prevent the contamination of the Christian visual sphere by the scripts of a marginalized and now officially non-existent minority. The formal deconsecration of Jewish ritual spaces followed a rigorous liturgical protocol dictated by the local dioceses. Former synagogues were subjected to cleansing ceremonies involving the use of incense, holy water, and the recitation of Latin exorcism formulas, rituals intended to redeem the structures from their previous religious utility. This process of architectural conversion frequently involved the installation of Christian iconography, such as stone crosses or statues of saints, into the former niches of the Aron Kodesh. By overwriting the Jewish sacred geometry with Christian symbolic markers, the municipal authorities ensured that the former centers of the Aljama were physically and spiritually integrated into the parochial network of the city. This transformation served as a permanent visual signifier of the Church's perceived victory over the old law, turning the very stones that had once housed Jewish prayer into monuments of their definitive exclusion. Furthermore, the cleansing of the urban fabric extended to the renaming of the topographical landscape. Streets previously designated as Judengasse or Judenrein were formally renamed to reflect Christian virtues, local trades, or the names of the new patrician owners. This linguistic erasure ensured that the Jewish presence was removed from the vernacular memory of the burgesses, making it increasingly difficult for future generations to locate the historical boundaries of the Jewish quarters. In Zurich, the redirection of the urban street plan after 1298 effectively dissolved the cohesive identity of the Jewish enclaves, absorbing them into a generic municipal grid that lacked any signifier of its previous demographic character. This policy of topographical purging was essential for the consolidation of the new urban order, as it removed the physical prompts that might have sustained a collective memory of the expelled population. The treatment of liturgical remnants, such as Torah scrolls and ritual textiles, provided the final act of this religious purification. While the most valuable silver ornaments were melted into bullion for the city treasury, the parchment scrolls were frequently subjected to ritualized destruction or utilized as scrap material for the binding of Christian administrative ledgers. This practice of textual recycling turned the sacred documents of the Jewish faith into the literal binding of the municipal laws that had mandated their removal. The physical environment of the Swiss city-states by the turn of the 14th century was thus characterized by a total absence of Jewish signifiers. This comprehensive visual cleansing ensured that the 1298 expulsion was experienced by the remaining Christian populace as a totalizing and irreversible event. By removing the Hebrew inscriptions and deconsecrating the ritual spaces, the Swiss authorities finalized the transition of the Jewish community from a living presence into a spectral, unrecorded past, physically realizing the homogeneity that the legal edicts had only theoretically proclaimed. The immediate demographic aftermath of the 1298 Swiss expulsion was characterized by a fragmented resettlement pattern that concentrated the survivors within the upper Rhenish bailiwicks of Alsace and the eastern ancestral domains of the House of Habsburg in the Duchy of Austria. In the Alsatian Sundgau and the emerging Decapolis, Seinstädtebund, the arrival of the Swiss refugees occurred within a highly complex jurisdictional environment where the Bishop of Strasbourg and the local Landvogte competed for the right to tax the new arrivals. Unlike the integrated urban existence they had maintained in the Swiss plateau, the exiles in Alsace were often restricted to the status of Beisassen, or protected residents without full municipal rights, frequently being forced to settle in secondary market towns such as Colmar and Mulhouse. This transition was governed by the Handfesten, or town charters, which in Alsace were increasingly restrictive, mandating that the newcomers provide immediate liquid security to the local bailiffs as a condition for temporary domicile. The resettlement in the Duchy of Austria represented a strategic movement toward the private patrimonial lands of Albert I, where the legal environment was more stable than the volatile imperial free cities of the Swiss interior. Because the Habsburgs sought to rebuild the fiscal infrastructure of their home territories after the exhaustion of the dynastic wars, they facilitated the entry of the Swiss Jewish elite into the urban centers of Vienna and Wiener Neustadt. In these Austrian cities, the exiles were integrated into the existing Judenstadt, Jewish quarter, under the oversight of the Judenmeister, a crown-appointed official responsible for the collection of the Zuzugsgebühren, or entry fees. The arrival of the Swiss survivors in Vienna provided a vital injection of financial expertise into the Austrian ducal treasury, as many of the refugees possessed the bookkeeping skills required to manage the complex toll systems of the Danube Valley. However, this integration was fraught with internal friction, as the established Viennese Jewish community viewed the Swiss newcomers as economic competitors for the limited number of licensed lending positions permitted by the Ducal Judenordnung. The socio-economic profile of the Swiss refugees shifted dramatically during this period, moving from a class of monumental municipal financiers to one of small-scale retail lenders and pawnbrokers. The loss of their primary capital reserves during the Swiss purges meant that most families were unable to repurchase the stone house status they had held in Zurich or Bern, instead inhabiting rented timber structures in the peripheral zones of their new cities. This physical degradation of their living conditions was mirrored in their legal standing. In the Austrian lands, the refugees were subjected to the Kammergrafen system, where their legal protection was managed by specialized court counts who extracted a significant percentage of their annual earnings. The fragmented nature of this resettlement ensured that the communal cohesion of the former Swiss aljamas was permanently dissolved, replaced by a series of isolated family units navigating the disparate legal codes of the Rhenish and Danubian principalities. Furthermore, the resettlement in Alsace was frequently interrupted by the hostility of the land, as the local guilds, observing the success of the Swiss expulsion, pushed for similar exclusionary measures in the Alsatian towns. This necessitated a secondary migration of many families toward the Palatinate or the bishopric of Speyer, creating a perpetual cycle of transience that defined the first decade of the 14th century. The Swiss survivors thus became a mobile demographic of perpetual aliens, whose residency was constantly renegotiated through the payment of extraordinary Schutzgeld, protection money, to whichever local lord could offer the most immediate physical security. The 1298 expulsion had successfully transformed the Swiss Jewry into a dispersed diaspora, whose historical records in Alsace and Austria remain limited to the fiscal entries of tax collectors and the brief mention of new residents from the Swabian lands. This chapter of the displacement finalized the transition of the community from an indigenous Helvetian entity to a fragmented Rhenish Danubian minority, ending the cohesive history of the first Jewish presence in the central Alpine territories. The arrival of the 1299 administrative year in the Swiss city-states of Bern, Zurich, and Basel signaled the definitive establishment of a new homogeneous political reality, characterized by the total absence of the Jewish legal class. This period was defined by a profound legal vacuum, as the ancient imperial statutes governing the Judei proprii were rendered obsolete and were gradually removed from the active Ratsmanuale, council manuals. The 1299 imperial pardon issued by King Albert III functioned as the final codification of this void, as the Crown's formal acceptance of the loss of its servants meant that the central government no longer recognized a Jewish presence within the Swiss interior. This transition transformed the Swiss plateau from a multifaceted jurisdictional landscape into a collection of religiously uniform municipal republics, where the legal identity of the inhabitant was now inextricably linked to the Christian sacraments and guild membership. The fiscal consequences of this homogeneity necessitated a rapid restructuring of the municipal credit systems, as the towns could no longer rely on the transactional revenue of the jury tax or the liquid reserves of specialized financiers. To fill this vacuum, the Swiss city-states began to facilitate the entry of Italian banking interests, specifically the Lombards or Cahorsans, who operated under strictly regulated municipal licenses that prohibited the long-term residency and property ownership previously granted to the Jewish community. This shift toward itinerant, non-resident Christian financiers ensured that the city councils maintained absolute control over the credit market without the social burden of a permanent religious minority. The 1299 economic data indicates a shift toward shorter-term, higher security lending, which stabilized the municipal treasuries but limited the capital available for the ambitious urban expansions of the previous century. The long period of absence, initiated in 1298, would endure for nearly 150 years, as the Swiss municipal councils maintained a policy of territorial purity that prevented the reestablishment of permanent Jewish quarters until the mid-14th century. During this interim, the legal status of a Jew in the Swiss lands was reduced to that of a Durchreisender, or a transient traveler, permitted to cross the territory only under the most restrictive Geleit, escort terms, and forbidden from remaining overnight within the city walls. This administrative exclusion was reinforced by the growing power of the Swiss Confederacy, which viewed the demographic homogeneity of the cantons as a source of internal stability and a signifier of their independent Christian character. The physical remains of the Jewish presence, from the repurposed stone houses to the buried foundations of the mikvahot, were absorbed into the municipal infrastructure to such an extent that their original functions were largely forgotten by the local populace. The 1298 expulsion thus served as a foundational moment for the development of the modern Swiss cantonal system, establishing a precedent of municipal sovereignty over religious residency that would define the region's political culture for the remainder of the Middle Ages. The legal vacuum of 1299 was not an accidental byproduct of violence, but a deliberate architectural choice by the Swiss elite to create a closed, autonomous social order. By the turn of the century, the Jewish question in the Alpine Rhine had been resolved through the totalizing application of municipal law and the physical removal of the community's assets. This chapter concludes the history of the first Swiss Jewry, recording the moment when the central Alpine territories transitioned into a landscape of empty streets and cleansed archives, marking the start of a multi-century hiatus in the Jewish history of the region. The 1298 events proved that the medieval city-state possessed the administrative capacity to unilaterally terminate its relationship with the imperial order, using the demographic removal of a minority to signal its emergence as a fully sovereign and homogeneous political entity.